Okay, class, this is a review of chapter 24 on World War One. The chapter title is The Nation at War. Okay, before getting into the book, kind of goes right to the Lusitania, but before going into that, it's good to see how the war actually started and a map of the beginning of the war. And at this point, the United States was not yet in the war at all. You could see here, and this would be in 1914. You can see the very large, powerful countries in red, called the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary in the center of the map. And then down a little bit, just down from there, you look for Serbia in green right underneath Hungary. Serbia was also called Yugoslavia. So what happened was Austria, Hungary, and Germany were strong allies or friends with each other um, militarily. Austria-Hungary, a powerful empire, it exerted a lot of control over Serbia, Yugoslavia, and most of the Serbians did not want that and didn't want. They wanted total freedom. But Austria-Hungary very arrogantly sent its Archduke on a trip into Serbia, and at that time, some assassins from Serbia attacked and killed the Archduke and his wife. They were called the Black Hand, a terrorist group, but also a nationalist group in Yugoslavia that just simply didn't want any leaders from Austria in there. So as a result of the assassination, Austria-Hungary decided in revenge to invade Serbia and sent their troops to attack Serbia. This is what began World War One because it set off a chain reaction where the countries in green all came to Serbia's aid. Russia came in as an ally. Italy, especially France and England, came in as an ally and basically declared war on Germany and Austria. And it set off this massive chain reaction, which was World War One. What was to make this different than any other war before it was that these countries had built up modern weaponry for the first time in world history. There was massive artillery cannons in all of these countries. And for the first time, machine guns were manufactured and in use, widely in use, machine guns. Um, Beginning of gas warfare, even the very first airplanes were being used, and landmines. So for the first time uh, in world history, it was called industrialized warfare, which, before that you had seen wars with single shot rifles and much different kind of warfare. This was highly deadly, and that's what was to lead to millions and millions of casualties and deaths on the battlefront. Um, so more while the leaders really stayed detached from the battlefront, remember there were no cameras, or it was only verbal or written reports to the leaders of these countries about what was going on. So mostly they were quite disconnected with the realities of the battlefront. In the meantime, the fighting was going on in which soldiers were just running up and being shot down by machine guns, literally by the tens of thousands every day. So it became one of the most brutal, it became the most brutal war in history up until that time, World War One. So you see France and England were fighting Germany, Austria, and that was the red line at the top of France is called the Western Front, where most of the fighting occurred. And then you see Russia, where it's green by Germany. That's called the Eastern Front, where also a large amount of fighting occurred. Very little fighting occurred in the cities of these countries, practically none. It was all out in these kind of muddy, detached battlefields away from civilization. But the small towns around the battlefields were obviously very, damaged, and civilians were killed. But mostly, it was soldiers who were being killed. Another aspect of the war was food and supplies was always being shipped to the front. So the civilians in many of the countries were experiencing major food shortages, especially in Russia. It really was a disaster in Russia as far as the lack of food and supplies for their winters because it was all being sent to the battlefront. So this was already going on before the United States had entered the war for 2 years. Um, and one of the major events that brought the United States into the war was the sinking of the passenger ship, the Lusitania. And there you see a picture of the ship going down. And this is when the German government decided to have all out warfare, even torpedoing passenger ships. And the German military rationalized that decision, saying that some of the passenger ships may have been carrying some military supplies. And that actually may be true, but that these were still civilian ships, and to sink them, in which thousands of vacationers were being killed, really brought an outrage across the world against Germany. And the Lusitania really turned the world against Germany in this war. And in addition, it began to turn the United States, minds of the United States began to shift towards possibly entering the war. So the Lusitania did have a huge impact. And even though President Woodrow Wilson was totally a peace president, he even began to make statements in the newspapers that this was unacceptable. And his favorite line about it was that this was an attack on the freedom of the seas. But still, the peace movement was still holding back uh, the beginning of war, and Woodrow Wilson was still strongly connected to the peace movement. So he resisted the war for almost another 2 years. Here's another slide of the Lusitania having been sunk. This one is in your textbook in chapter 24. Um, so yes, this in the United States was huge news, and in newspapers across the world. But what finally brought the United States into World War One was what the textbook calls the Zimmerman telegram, which is correct. The Zimmerman telegram, or sometimes called the Zimmerman letter, which was a secret attempt by Germany to send a letter to Mexican leaders to ask Mexico to attack the United States in a secret alliance. And of course, Mexico had no interest in doing this, but just the idea that Germany was trying to bring Mexico into the war by literally attacking the United States southern border was enough to push um, President Woodrow Wilson into asking Congress to declare war on Germany. So it did bring the United States into World War One. Here you see newspapers across the United States after the Congress declared war um, were telling Americans that the United States had entered World War One. At this time, a little over 2 years of the war had been going on, though. But when the United States finally entered, this was a major change because now you had millions of U.S. troops headed to Europe to fight on the side of France and England. And Woodrow Wilson, a peacetime president, really was very effective at leading the country during war and mobilized factories across the country building weapons, ships, tanks, military supplies, and quickly mobilized the country and basically nationalized the country for a short time into to doing this. And people really did rise to uh, his calls to join the war effort. There were victory gardens at home and people growing their own food to help with the war effort. And people across the country, you had huge shifts in migration. You had African Americans moving north to work in the factories, but also many African Americans joined the army to fight in the war on the side of the United States. And women worked in large amounts in factories building materials that were needed for the war. So there was this huge change on the home front that went on for that year and a half that the U.S. was in the war. So with the new, fresh U.S. troops coming into an exhausted battlefront, then American troops went in and were in some horribly vicious battles, but many of the battles after that started to be won by the United States and France and England in what had really been a stalemate or a tie for so long, greatly shifted towards the French and English and the American side. And within a year, Germany began to crumble, and so did the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and they were near truce. But one of the big changes in world history that came out of this was that the Russians, who were also on the American side in this war, their government completely collapsed from lack of so much food shortages and revolution in Russia. And the government of Russia collapsed as a result of World War One and was taken over by a communist totalitarian state under Stalin and became known as the Soviet Union. And that change really affected the next 70 years of world history, is that Russia went from a monarchy to a communist totalitarian country as a result of their losses in World War One. So anyway, the war went on. It went on for another year and a half. And we see here in this newspaper article, among many others, that the U.S. was at war, and it certainly was the most important thing going on to most Americans at the time. But the fact that it was mostly an industrialized kind of warfare, mostly soldiers were fighting by the hundreds, and so there weren't individual heroes per se. Not that they weren't heroes, but you didn't see a lot of one-on-one fighting where an individual would be fighting. Normally, it was large groups charging over the barbed wire, what they call no man's land, and then trying to overcome the machine gun fire. So it was very difficult to any individual effort really was not able to change a battle. But one of the heroes that Americans used to talk about was Eddie Rickenbacker. He's a pilot in this picture, and he was able to fly a number of successful missions. These are not bombers, but fighting German planes in one-on-one air battles with these really old-fashioned double-wing airplanes. Uh, Not that much more advanced from the day of the Wright brothers. And these fights went on, and Rickenbacker won the Medal of Honor and many other medals, and he became at least someone Americans could be happy about and think about as a hero. There's another picture of Eddie Rickenbacker. He actually was a race car driver for a while and a pilot, and then after the war he did live and became involved in flying. And and what he used to write his life of adventure. Um, he even wrote a comic book strip for a while. So he became one of the most famous soldiers, or actually pilots, in World War One. Um, but the basic fighting was in the trenches. You see soldiers here living in trenches for months and months at a time. Very difficult life, sometimes very muddy and bad weather and rats and all, very difficult. But they maintained discipline and in most cases and fought very dangerous battles throughout the war. There's a recent movie out called 1917. I think it is. It's a very good, one of the few movies about World War One, but it's a very good movie. It shows the front um, and really shows the one particular mission, which was really interesting. So the war went on until 1980, right? And the war ended in 1918, and Germany surrendered and took responsibility in the treaty for having caused the war, although they really didn't. They were pretty bitter about doing that, but that's what ultimately happened. They surrendered, and also at the time, President Wilson managed to create something called the League of Nations, hoping that nations would meet in the future and try to avoid future war. So yeah, the war ended, and then the American soldiers came back to the United States. But that year, of course, they had to deal also with the horrible 1918 flu, which was a monumental natural disaster. In World War One itself, um, it's, estimates have the deaths in fighting is at 15 million to 20, and it's probably quite a bit over 20 million died. 118,000 Americans died in the war, which was quite a lot in just about 1 year. When you consider in Vietnam over 8 or 9 years, there was 60,000 lost. This was 118,000 in 1 year, so it was a very rough war for the United States. But at the end, it did end in victory and some changes in the boundaries of Europe. Okay, so you could just write um, probably two paragraphs on this review. Um, the we've covered this chapter and the other chapter, which was the progressives. So write that and turn that in for this class. Um,